Hey,
Hi.
how are you?
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm good. I'm so excited for the conference today.
Yeah, super excited.
I'm glad we could share a ride. Parking is going to be atrocious.
Yeah, super excited about this car ride.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that really what you decided to wear to the conference? Like, you take a long time to pick that out?
Yeah, I mean, we can't all wear gym chic or whatever that is. I could take you shopping sometime if you wanted to look like a grown-up.
No, that's okay. Thank you, though.
Okay. It's so weird. The other day, I brought an egg salad sandwich into the office, and I put it in the fridge like I always do with my name on it.
Okay.
Well, it disappeared by lunchtime. And Tanya said there was an egg salad sandwich on your desk afterward. They could smell it. That's how they knew.
On my desk?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really weird.
So weird.
Super weird.
Yeah.
Actually, not that I ate your sandwich, but even if I tried to eat your sandwich, I couldn't because I'm actually gluten-free, but I thought you would have remembered that because, I said that in the office, but you were obviously not listening, so weird.
Huh. I'm actually also gluten-free, which I thought you would have remembered. Yeah.
You're gluten-free?
Yeah.
You've never mentioned that in the office. That's weird.
So weird.
Yeah, actually, it's weird.
Oh, look, we're here. So glad we could share a ride today.
Yeah, so glad. It's great. We should do it again.
A little cringy, right? Well, hey, last week Kendall kicked off our series Awkward Turtles by reminding us that we have to talk it out in relationships. And he showed us how communication can definitely be awkward, but it's also foundational for all of our relationships. And this week, I thought I would make it extra awkward for our time together. And I dressed like Kendall. Right? Because he nailed the turtle look, and I can definitely just be awkward. So here we are. But remember, an awkward turtle are those moments where things are just awkward. And you're trying to keep your face from giving away your thoughts. And so you just take your hands and you give this little signal to someone so that they know that you know that this moment is awkward. And just so you know, I can't really see much from up here. So if at any time this morning you just need to give this little guy to somebody near you so that they know that you know that this is awkward, I won't know. So go ahead. And you're probably not alone. Because full disclosure, when we started planning this series and who was going to do what, someone asked me what I wanted to teach on. And as I started to say anything but conflict, he typed my name down next to conflict. And because I would rather pull out my eyelashes and my toenails one by one than engage in conflict, I just smiled and said, "That sounds great." Hi, I'm Lisa, and I hate conflict of any kind with anyone ever. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this morning, and we thank you that we can be here together. I pray that you would just help us to see that conflict actually can help us maintain and have good and healthy relationships. Help us to see how that is possible. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so last week we learned that we need to talk it out. And this week, for relationships to be healthy, we also need to fight it out. See, healthy relationships have conflict, but it's not unresolved conflict. And as I was processing what to say, I realized that I actually have no shortage of examples of conflict, or rather a lack thereof. For example, and I did ask permission, so conflict will not follow, my husband, Anthony, because it's easier to talk about him, might be a spicy Italian man. If you know him, you know. But what you might not know about him is that he hates confrontation. And so about 10 years ago, Anthony introduced himself to a new friend. Actually, it was Pete, the guitar player that stands right back there. And instead of hearing Anthony, what Pete heard was AJ. Okay? And so when Pete said, "It's good to meet you, AJ," Anthony did not correct him, thinking that maybe he had misheard. And after about a year of being AJ, Anthony resigned himself to the fact that this was just his name now, right? Because the time for correcting had passed. And if you're wondering, well, maybe Anthony's middle name is James or John, or maybe he's a junior. He's not, and those are not his middle names. And so AJ does not make sense. And so when he went over to Pete's house to help with a project, he was introduced to everyone as AJ. But it didn't stop there. See, AJ is still 2 syllables. And so in the midst of the project, Pete did what any good friend would do, and he gave him a nickname, Age. So now Pete is yelling, "Age, can you grab the drill?" And then it would take Anthony a few minutes every time to remember that he is Age. Awkward, right? Or the time that I showed up at work without any mascara on, and my friend never said anything. See, I have really light-colored eyelashes and very squinty eyes. And so without mascara, I end up looking like this. And because I'm a mostly forgiving person, I asked her to never do that again. I gave her permission to always ask what's wrong with my face. And so we moved on. Until the next time. And can you believe that these 2 friends are married to each other? And maybe more remarkable is that we're all still friends. But I also get it. See, I took a quiz the other day to find out what kind of people pleaser I am. You can find a quiz for anything. And this were my results. You are the avoider. If you had a motto, it would be peace at all cost. As the avoider, you hate conflict. You're easygoing and agreeable. You likely know it's wrong, but you also don't want to ruffle any feathers. You feel your best when everyone else around you is happy. It's when you feel safest and most secure within your relationships and environment. You work hard to keep the peace just to make sure that everyone around you is getting along. You may also have lost sight of the things that make you happy and the desires that God has for your life. Perhaps that's something to consider as you begin this journey to go from people pleaser to God pleaser. After all, it's God who gave you those desires in the first place. Okay? Can anyone else relate to that? Some of you are like, no. I don't understand anything that you're talking about because I have absolutely no problem voicing how I feel, right? Some of you are like, I love to ruffle feathers just to see what's gonna happen. And can I just say that I don't understand you people. Knowingly causing conflict, that does not compute in my mind. But listen, avoid the temptation to nudge that person next to you right now, okay? Just keep your eyes up here. Don't give them the "this one's for you," right? Like all of those things. We're all part of the problem. Whether we're knowingly engaging in conflict that's not helpful or we're avoiding it at all cost. And this statement, these feelings, the said and the unsaid, this is how conflict begins. And let's be very clear, conflict can happen in any relationship. It's not just family relationships. And if you've ever had a job or a friend or a neighbor, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Conflict is inevitable when 2 or more are gathered. And it's probably right around now that you're wondering why they chose this girl to talk about this stuff. Me too. But I think it's because they knew that I needed this as much or maybe even more than you. And thankfully, when it comes to conflict, this book, the Bible, is full of stories. And not all were handled well. But even in those stories, there are lessons that we can learn and apply to our lives and our conflicts today. So here we go. Once upon a time, because you know the best stories always start with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a dad named Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Now, just so you know, this guy also had 2 wives and 2 concubines. And so I have to believe that there was a lot of conflict there. But I'm going to focus on the sons for today. But Jacob played favorites with his wives and his sons. And so not shockingly, his favorite son, Joseph, belonged to his favorite wife, Rachel. And so you can imagine when a dad plays favorites, conflict will follow. And so it did. And Jacob may not have been the brightest bulb in the bunch. He didn't even try to hide his favoritism for Joseph. It says here that Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. And if you're a fan of the theater, then already you were thinking about Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Now you have all the songs in your head. But you also know what's coming. Because the next verse says, but his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. Now listen, I have one sister. She's younger, and we had plenty of conflict just between the two of us. So I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be Joseph and had 10 older brothers who despised me. And to be honest, Joseph didn't do himself any favors. See, he was a bit cocky, and he knew that he was the favorite, and he knew that he could pretty much get away with just about anything. See, Joseph was a dreamer. And not like a daydreamer, but he would have these dreams where he realized that God was going to do something in his life. He was going to make him greater than his brothers, and that they would actually bow down before him one day. And there are two things that we need to know here. Number one, in the ancient world, there were customs and traditions that were followed, one being that of the birthright. See, the oldest son was entitled to a double portion of their father's inheritance, and then each son after that would get a divided portion of whatever was left. And so for most families, the oldest son was the favorite, and the brothers would just expect and accept that. And then second, even if Joseph had had these crazy dreams, it might have seemed wise to just keep your trap shut. But not so for Joseph. See, on multiple occasions, he trots out to where his brothers are hard at work in the fields in his fancy robe with his fancy sleeves that were not suitable for manual labor, and then he would tell his brothers about these dreams. And I don't think that he got the response that he was looking for. So his brothers say, "So you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way that he talked about them. But Joseph remained oblivious. And shortly after, when he was once again sent to check on his brothers, the hatred and the jealousy was just too much for them. And they had had enough of Joseph and his dreams and his colorful robe. And so when they saw him coming, the only natural response in that moment was this. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." Logical, right? But don't worry, there is one voice of reason amongst the brothers. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. "Let's not kill him," he said. "Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he will die without our laying a hand on him." Okay, so maybe not a voice of reason. And speaking of awkward, Reuben definitely had an ulterior motive. See, he needed to get back on his dad's good side after making some questionable decisions with one of Jacob's concubines, the mother of two of Reuben and Joseph's brothers. So I'm just gonna let that one lie, okay? I mean, this is for reals in the Bible, but Reuben did prevent his brothers from killing Joseph, and he actually thought that he would be able to go back, grab Joseph, and then return him safely to their dad, showing up as the hero in the story. But plot twist. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe that he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. Then just as they were sitting down to eat, because, after you do things to your brother like that, you just grab a sandwich. They looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother. our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. So to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what the going rate for a younger brother is these days. But to give you some context, 20 pieces or 20 shekels of silver is about 8 ounces, which, depending on the silver trade today, is up and down, but it's about $260. And then to give you even more context, the going rate for a slave at the time of Joseph's sale was between 15 and 30 shekels. So he was sold for 20. So it feels like his brothers might have undersold Joseph just to get rid of him as fast as possible. And just to be clear, I tell you this story as a descriptive story, not prescriptive. That is fancy pastor talk for I'm telling you what did happen, not what should happen, okay? Big brothers, do not sell your younger, cocky, annoying little brothers to traveling salesmen, okay? In fact, don't throw them in ditches either, and don't steal their stuff, okay? That's not the point of this story. What I hope you can see is that conflict, when it's not dealt with, it does not end well. And lots of people get hurt. And in this story, Joseph ends up as a house slave and then in prison in Egypt. And Jacob's dad is devastated. He never fully recovers after he finds out that Joseph was killed by a wild animal, which is the story that he was told by his other sons. And the brothers who were left with that ongoing guilt and shame of what they had done, out of jealousy and hatred and rage, they never got over that shame. And I'm sure you've experienced something like this before, where conflict builds and it builds without any resolution, and then people get hurt. Marriages end, children are estranged, friendships are severed, jobs are lost. Every relationship is at risk when conflict is not dealt with. And there are always casualties. So I shared with you a way not to handle conflict. The brothers chose not to face conflict within the family. There was no family meeting. There was no interventions with Jacob. There was no pass the talking stick along so that everyone could share their feelings. The only thing that they could think of to alleviate the tension in their family was to kill the problem, literally. And this still happens today. This isn't just an ancient world problem that we have totally figured out. We still avoid difficult conversations thinking that it will kill the problem if enough time passes. We check out and we numb out on our phones. We gossip behind someone's back instead of having that necessary face-to-face conversation. We soothe ourselves with unhealthy behaviors. And I know I'm not alone here. It feels easier in those moments to avoid the conversations and the conflict at all costs. But what we know when we're not in the middle of all of that is that avoiding and numbing and soothing, they don't work in the long run. And thankfully, the story doesn't end with Joseph being enslaved in Egypt. Because if you fast forward 22 years, Joseph has been busy. He spent 13 years enslaved and imprisoned. And then he finds himself as Pharaoh's right-hand man, who was in charge of ensuring that in the middle of a 7-year famine, the Egyptians would still have plenty of food. And so imagine Joseph's surprise when 10 bedraggled brothers show up in Egypt about 2 years into the famine. And he recognized the men from Canaan, but they had no idea that the man that they were trying to buy food from was their long-lost brother that they had sold to the traveling merchants that one time. And so here we go. What's Joseph gonna do? What would you do? To be honest, I'm not sure what I would do. I mean, he's had 22 years to plot and scheme and plan what he would do if he ever saw one of those brothers again. And so here's what he did. So Joseph put them all in prison for 3 days. It checks out, right? He doesn't leave them there, but they have 3 days where they get to think about what's going on. And Joseph does not reveal who he is, but right in front of Joseph, they start arguing with each other. Clearly, we are being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we didn't listen. That's why we're in this trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? Reuben asked, but you wouldn't listen. And now we have to answer for his blood. Of course, they didn't know that Joseph understood them, for he had been speaking to them through an interpreter. But just wait, because things are about to take a turn, and not like the turn that it took before. It says, now he turned away from them and began to weep. See, Joseph recognized that in that moment, holding on to his bitterness and anger and frustration and rage and disappointment and grief and whatever else he had been holding on to for those 20 plus years was not worth holding on to any longer. He was ready. He was almost ready to have the conversation that his brothers should have had 22 years before. Now let's be real. Joseph played a few little brother games, with the boys. He just wanted to keep the fear of God in them a little longer. But eventually Joseph was ready to reveal his identity to his brothers. Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all Egypt." Joseph could have continued to play the game. He could have refused to face the decades of conflict that had been building. He could have avoided and refused to help his family. He could have gone with the eye for an eye approach that many of us take today. He could have stuck with the golden rule and treated his brothers the way that they had treated him. But instead, Joseph took a different approach, one of kindness and humility and gentleness. He chose to be completely honest, face the conflict head on, and be compassionate. And the brothers recognized it. They knew that this is not what they deserved, nor is it how they would have responded if they were in Joseph's sandals. And as soon as their dad dies, the brothers, instead of addressing that awkward turtle in the room, they assume that they know what Joseph has been scheming this whole time. But now that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers became fearful. "Now Joseph will show his anger and pay us back for all the wrong that we did to him," they said. So they sent this message to Joseph. "Before your father died, he instructed us to say to you, 'Please forgive your brothers for the great wrong that they did to you, for their sin in treating you so cruelly. So we, the servants of God of your father, beg you to forgive our sin.' And when Joseph received the message, he broke down and wept. Then his brothers came and threw themselves down before Joseph. 'Look, we are your slaves,' they said. But Joseph, remaining true to who he was, once again chose to wade into the brotherly conflict, and he responded like this: 'Don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children.' So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them." So what can we learn from Joseph? How can we practically wade into the tensions of conflict and deal with it in a healthy and productive way? Because for many of us, our versions of handling conflict looks like what Tom talked about a few weeks ago when he talked about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It looks like silent criticism and contempt and defensiveness and stonewalling. we're walking on eggshells and shutting down, or we're exploding. But what if there was another way? What do we do with conflict? How do we navigate those tense moments that have the potential to destroy? I think there are 3 things that we can put into practice to help us face the conflict that is in front of us instead of fleeing from it. And the first one is this: focus on the real issue. I can't tell you how many times I've been in this surface level conflict, and I suppose that part of it has to do with me not wanting to hurt someone, and so I avoid even the most benign conflicts, which I have learned is not helpful. But others might be so logical and so black and white when they're thinking that they lose sight of what's really going on. They see the action that upset them instead of the core issue that is propelling the action. For instance, suppose that someone didn't return your call or text you back, and it bothered you. But maybe the week prior, you cut down the other person or you blew them off. And though that lack of response upsets you, there's an even deeper issue of past hurt on the other person's side. What they did isn't necessarily right, but it helps to understand the bigger picture and then the core issue in order to properly address the conflict. What I'm learning is not helpful or productive in these situations is to bring up these past, these distant things, these hurts that we've harbored for months or even years. These things need to be addressed at some point, but in this moment, focus on the main issue, the real issue of right now. But what we can see from Joseph's example is that he addressed what was really going on. He understood why his brothers had done what they did and why. Even though revenge or pretending would have been easier, he chose to address it. He straight up calls out that his brothers had intended him harm, but he's choosing to move on. And James, Jesus' little brother, he actually understood this too when he wrote that you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. Human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires. And if you're like, I'm so sick and tired of hearing that verse, me too. But it feels like this keeps coming up because we are still not putting it into practice. We are still not doing what James said to do. During my message run through on Thursday, one of our staff members, he shared this little nugget from a book that he had read. And while I understand it, I do not love it. Because what he said is that we need to view conflict as a gift. The book said, instead of seeing conflict as something that's in the way, try to see it as the way. Too often we see conflict as the impediment to peace instead of the path to peace. So when you find yourself in conflict with someone or even in a heated fight it out of nowhere, look for the foundation of the argument. Get to the root of the cause. By addressing what's at the core of the disagreement, you can come to a proper resolution. However, if you fail to go deep in the nitty-gritty and you only address the surface action that upset one of you, you end up bypassing true resolution. You put a temporary Band-Aid on the conflict instead of truly taking care of the hurt. So that's number 1. Number 2, don't overreact. A surefire way to cut a conversation short and miss resolution is by overreacting and exploding out of anger. The other person will most likely shrink into their shell, see what I did, or explode in return. And neither will lead to a solution. Giving in to the anger that you might be experiencing will most likely lead to further tension, which is then why Proverbs 15 says that a gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. Once again, Joseph understood this. Sure, he locked his brothers up for a few days, but in his face-to-face conversation, he did not overreact or respond in anger. Instead, he remained cool and calm and collected. And we can learn from Joseph. When you feel that anger boiling up within you, take a deep breath and remember to act out of love and gentleness. It won't always be easy, but as you practice this technique, God can actually start to transform your conversations. Chances are you care about the person that you're working through this conflict with. So carry that with you. Remember the care that you have for them and respond from that place. And then last, propose a solution. After feelings have been expressed and each person has communicated that they understand the other one, it's best to find a solution. This may mean setting boundaries so that feelings are no longer hurt in the future. It may mean being more strategic in spending time together. What if each person had a different idea of what a solution looks like? Well, something that I heard a wise counselor say once is that if each person has a different interpretation of a resolution, always have a plan C, D, E, Y. Keep going, because there's always common ground for a solution. And if that means that you have to make a list over the dinner table late at night, then do it. Find a solution that you can both agree on. Jesus, in one of his messages, blesses the peacemakers. These are those people who diffuse the conflict. When you find a solution, you diffuse the conflict because you're creating a way to avoid that same conflict in the future. Don't go into the conflict with the intention of winning. If you win, that means that the other person loses. And you still lose because that person, the person that you care about, lost. Sometimes it feels like we forget what matters. We prioritize being right over the relationships. And sometimes we do that without even realizing the carnage that we leave in the wake of rightness. Find a way that both of you can move forward in peace. This is the only true way to reconcile conflict. And the bad news is, conflict is inevitable. So learning how to deal with conflict properly will significantly change the health and the length of any relationship. And it's an area that we can grow in. It takes practice, but it's possible. So as we close, I want you to listen to these words that were written by Paul to a church that needed some reminders about what it looks like to practically live out life as followers of Jesus. They needed to be encouraged that even when your circumstances are tough, that they can still show up well with mercy and kindness. He wrote, "Since God chose you to be the holy people he loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us together in perfect harmony. And let the peace that comes from Christ rule in your hearts. For as members of one body, you are called to live in peace. And always be thankful." So let's stand and sing, remembering that it's only because of what Jesus was willing to do for us that we are able to confront conflict with humility, gentleness, and patience.